Hi everyone, it's Kelly here. If this is your first time coming to my channel, welcome. Thanks for stopping by. And if you're coming back again after seeing some of my other videos, welcome back. I'm so glad to have you. I have been enjoying very much this process of recording these videos and talking about books. It's really good to have somewhere where I can sort of talk about what I'm reading and what I'm planning on reading and just give my thoughts on books. And it's been really lovely chatting with people here in the comments on YouTube, but also over on my Instagram as well. If you're not already following me on Instagram and would like to, the link is going to be below in the description box. So you can look down there for the links to that and some of my other social media as well. All right, so today we are talking a wrap up. So this is a video where I'm going to chat about the books that I have read in October. Now, if you watched my October TBR, you may be surprised at how few of the books that I had planned to read in my October TBR that I actually got read this month. It has been a bit of an odd month, I think we can say, where I've just had a lot going on and I haven't been reading as much as I had planned. I say that, I did read quite a few books, so all up, I read 6 books. 6 books, which is okay. Like, I think that's quite tolerable. That's more than a book a week. So that's quite all right. However, the format of the books was the thing that was the problem, because I have been so busy and also because I have been wanting to read more audiobooks. I have read more audiobooks. So of the 6 books that I read this month, 4 of them were audiobooks, so that I was listening to them in the car or listening to them while I was doing something else that needed doing, like the washing up or, you know, all that kind of stuff, domestic stuff. So yeah, it's been a really good month for audiobooks for me. So let's look at it positively rather than I didn't read the books that I had planned to read. Okay, so let's have a look at what I did get read. So the first one was unfortunately not a book that I enjoyed too much. It was an audiobook, Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. And I did not really enjoy this audiobook at all. So the premise of the book, let me tell you a little bit about it. The premise of the book is we start with an AI. So she's like a very human-like robot, essentially. And the purpose of this type of AI is to be a companion for a child, to kind of be there as the child grows. And that's sort of what they're designed for and used for in this sort of, I would say, somewhat dystopian world. There is a bit of world building that goes on in terms of it being a place, you know, obviously it's a place where there are shops where you buy robots that look like people. So, you know, that's a bit world building in and of itself. However, also there was a bit of world building in terms of the context of, and it wasn't super clear, but there's some kind of procedure that children go through, and I think it's from memory called being lifted, and essentially it's, I think, supposed to sort of help you to be, I guess, a better student or a more intelligent person, and therefore to be able to, you know, get a high-powered, well-paid job. And if you can't afford to have your children lifted, then they're sort of doomed to not being able to achieve what the lifted children can achieve. So we've got our main character it's told from the perspective of one of these AI robots called Klara. And the reason she's sort of obsessed with the sun is the sun is her source of power, as in electrical power. So she presumably is somehow solar powered, although the mechanics of that are not really explained. But she sort of has this obsession with the son, and so there's a lot of kind of talk around that. And she meets this girl who comes into the shop, and they sort of form a bond. And there's a bit of will we, won't we, because the girl doesn't come back for some time. Another person wants to buy Klara, but she sort of holds out, which is not really the done thing. But the girl does end up coming back. Her name's Josie. And Josie has been lifted, but she's also had presumably either a reaction to this procedure or just had some kind of defect from birth, but she's unwell, and it's a little unclear as to what exactly it is that is making her unwell. But she's got a bit of a limp, and she's a little bit sickly. She can get unwell from time to time. So the premise of the story, so then it's sort of about their bond and Klara wanting to help Josie to be well, essentially, I guess is the outline of the plot. But the reason that I found it not particularly enjoyable was for two reasons. One, very slow pace. So it took a really long time to get into any sort of like intrigue or start to get enough answers that I felt compelled to keep going. So that was one thing. And the second thing was I just found, I've spoken about this at other times, probably not here yet. No, not here yet, but definitely over on my my Instagram. I've said you can get innocence quite wrong, I feel, as an author. And later on, I'll be talking about a book where I felt that was done really right and ended up being a 5-star read for me. But for this book, that innocence of this AI, that sort of childlike innocence of not really understanding, was just, it grated, and it was just made for, it was just irritating. And that's the main character who's telling the story. So it just made it really hard to kind of stay with it. So it actually took me a really long time. I started this audiobook in September, and it took me ages to get through it when it really shouldn't have. And it was because I just didn't want to pick it back up again. So I made myself finish it off just to be able to say that I have. But yeah, it really wasn't for me. I didn't enjoy it that much. I still did give it 3 stars. The way that everything kind of evolved and then resolved was compelling when we actually got there. And you were wondering, was it going to work? Was it going to work? And yeah, so in the end, it sort of got a little bit better, but it took far too long to get to that point for me. So it really wasn't very enjoyable. Unfortunately, I wanted to like this book a lot, but I couldn't get into it, and it wasn't for me. So I ended up giving it 3 stars. The next book I read, though, on audiobook, I loved so much that I ended up going out and buying a copy of myself. And this was one that was on my TBR, and it's called Islands of Decolonial Love by Leanne Betasamasaki Simpson. And I spoke about this one on my TBR video, so I won't go into too much detail here. But just to let you know, basically what it's about, it's a collection of different types of writing. So some of it is story, some of it is poetry, I would probably call it. But yeah, it was a really eye-opening and enjoyable read. And some of the ones that I enjoyed a lot, and I am going to mispronounce some of these titles, so I apologize. But the first one that I really loved was Wasayaban. It starts on page 23, so it's about the second or third. Sorry, no, there's actually quite a few before it. There's a couple that are before it. 1, 2, 3. So it's the 5th one in, and basically there's a little boy. Sorry, I should have said at the beginning. So this is this author is a First Nations author from Canada. And these are stories about the experience of First Nations people, predominantly her own people, but I presume that there would be overlap in these experiences from different groups from similar areas, or in the US as well. I would imagine as well there would be some overlap there. However, this was the one that I first really connected with in this collection, and it's about a little boy who is on a trip with his mum and siblings, I believe. And it's sort of just the way that it's told I really engaged with. And he has this little a little toy that is called Canoe, and he ends up losing Canoe in this caravan park in this incident that he has with a police officer. And this is like a little kid, and who has a security toy, and it's just really heartbreaking but heartwarming at the same time, of like that connection that he had with the toy was just really cute. Another one that I really, really liked, I've just got a couple of tabs here, was called She Told Him 10,000 Years of Everything, which is sort of like an ancestral spirit, but like that gets reborn into different people, and they kind of have to, these ancestral lovers have to re-find each other in their new bodies with each reincarnation, which I just loved that concept, and it was just so beautifully told. And also there was a really cool one at the end, which I think it's this one. Oh yeah, so there's one that's about it's about what are they called? A lift lock, which I believe there are quite a few of in Canada, where you can kind of get your boats over land. But this is like a mechanical one that was built a long time ago. Yeah, and the building of canals and hydro kind of systems, and how that has affected the people who are from that area, the First Nations people, and their connection with the land and things like that. So it was just really, I just loved it. And I felt very, despite not being from Canada or a First Nations person, and probably not the target audience of this book at all, I really connected with it and loved it, and just felt so blessed is a bit of a cheesy word to say about how I felt, but I felt really, I got a lot out of it. I felt blessed by it. Let's just say it. I felt blessed to read this book. And then I think it was the very last one. It is about this parade, and I straight up cried when I was listening to that one on the audiobook, and just the pride that they felt in that just really touched me. So I can't praise this book enough. I loved it so much. Islands of Decolonial Love by Leanne Betasamasaki Simpson. I hope I've said that correct. Yeah, it was a 5-star read for me. I loved it so much. The next book that I read, I was finishing off Transcendent Kingdom, which I talked about in my TBR. I was almost done. I just didn't quite get there in September, but I finished it off in October. And this was a 4-star read for me. I really enjoyed it. I hesitate to say the word loved. I liked it. I liked it a lot. So this was a book about a girl called Gifty, who her family is from Ghana, and they move before she's born. So her mother, her father, and her older brother move to America, and they live in Alabama, which is where she's conceived and is born. So she wasn't from Ghana, but her family are from Ghana. And it sort of is just talking a little bit about her experience of what it was like growing up in a place where they were, you know, the community of people from Ghana was quite small, and just some of those experiences. But it really centers around her relationship with her mother. And this is something that's told early on, the death of her brother. He dies from a drug overdose, which is sort of what propels her into studying addiction and the brain. So she is I'm going to say neuroscientist. It's probably the wrong term, but she's studying to be in that field, and in any case, researching with, you know, mice and that sort of thing around what it is that causes addiction, why it might be that some people are more predisposed to that, and so on. So that's sort of like the backdrop of the story, but the true part of this, the true story, the crux of the story is this relationship with her mother, which has been strained, and has been, you know, her brother was sort of the golden child and she was the afterthought, and that's how she's kind of grown up feeling about herself. And it's sort of her coming to terms with the relationship she has with her mother, and you know, trying to understand that as well. So I enjoyed this book a lot. It has definitely been something that you know, a lot of people who have lives that are touched by addiction in some way, and you know, my life has been touched by addiction, and so I felt quite connected to the story in that way, of just being able to relate to some of the things that she was talking about, having loved somebody with an addiction, and also there were a lot of religious elements, and I know that has turned some people off this book. But for me, so I grew up in religion, so a lot of it was very familiar to me. And the way she talked about church, although the church I grew up in was different to hers, I definitely kind of saw elements of my own childhood there, in terms of the types of people that you encounter in those kind of places. So yeah, it was definitely a really good read. I guess the only reason I probably didn't give it 5 stars is it hasn't really kind of it hasn't sat with me. I put it down. I enjoyed reading it. It didn't sit with me, like, especially not like Islands of Decolonial Love. That has sat with me, and I have it has definitely impacted me in that way. So this didn't quite have that same impact, but it's definitely a book I would recommend. Very, very enjoyable. So Transcendent Kingdom by Yagyasi. Liked it a lot. The next book that I read, I also listened to an audiobook of, and it's called The Year the Maps Changed by Danielle Binks, who's an Australian author that I had not heard of before picking this up. Although I then subsequently discovered that I had ordered a book of hers without realizing, just based on a recommendation. So I do actually have another one that I'm going to read as soon as I get a good chance of doing so, and have some time to devote to it. But I absolutely loved this book. So basically it's set back in, I believe it's 1999. It's set in 1999 in a town in Victoria in Australia, like a country town essentially, and we've got a young girl and her family. So her situation is I can't remember what the situation is with her biological father. I don't know whether she doesn't know him or what's going on there. I actually can't remember that. But she had her mother remarried. Her stepdad adopted her so that they were a family unit in the legal sense as well as in the loving sense. And then her mother passed away. So she's living with her stepfather, who has now, and sometime has passed, and is now has another partner, who has a son. So it's sort of real. I guess the core of the story is about the family dynamic, and that sort of, the awkwardness and having to feel it out kind of a sense that you would have in that situation of not really being sure of where you sort of fit within this new family dynamic. And for her, because it's her stepdad and not her biological dad, she sort of isn't sure whether she has as much of a claim anymore, and all of these kind of things. So it's that's sort of the core of the story. But around that, you have a refugee crisis that's going on, and refugees, it's sort of in the news at the beginning of the book, and then as the book goes on, a refugee center, I guess you would call it, it's sort of like a detention center essentially, is set up quite close to their small town. And so it's sort of the way that this town thinks about these refugees, and the mixed opinions that people have about them coming and interacting with them, and the conditions in which they're living and so on. So it's really, really meaty book, for a book that would essentially be a middle grade book. So the protagonist is in what we call year 6, so she'd be probably about 12, and she, and this is what I was talking about before, with that innocence and how sometimes you can get it really wrong. And in this book, Danielle Binks has done an amazing job of getting that perfectly right. You're never irritated by her innocence. I think she's written a 12-year-old kid really, really well. And I loved it. I absolutely loved this book so much. And I'm really looking forward to reading the one that I purchased without realizing that I already, without realizing it was the same author, which is called The Monster of Her Age, or A Monster of Her Age. So keep an eye out for that one. I'm sure I'll be mentioning that in my wrap up sometime very, very soon. So yeah, highly recommend The Year the Maps Changed by Danielle Binks. The next book that I also read on audiobook, but do have a physical copy of as well. And it's called Love Objects by Emily Mcguire, another Australian author. And this one is about a sort of extended family, essentially. So we've got 3 narrators. The first narrator that we meet, I think it's the first, is called Nick, and short for Nicole. Yeah, it is. So short for Nicole. And Nick is a hoarder, and she hasn't always been one, but she has developed this hoarding disorder, although she doesn't see it that way. And so she ends up at the very beginning having this really horrific fall inside her house, because she's climbing up on stuff to hang something she's just found up somewhere high, and she ends up falling off and awkwardly onto some of the stuff that's in her house, and having a horrific accident. She's not found for a couple of days, and I found myself, because I did not read the back or anything. It gets resolved. Sorry, that's a bit of a spoiler. She ends up being okay. She ends up surviving the fall. So she has this niece called Lena, who is at university, and they have a regular appointment to meet up for lunch, and Nick doesn't show up, and so she starts to get quite concerned when she's calling and no answer, and hasn't heard from her, and they end up going and finding her having fallen, and having been there for several days, bleeding and in a pretty bad state. So anyway, then we sort of get things from Lena's point of view and sort of find out some of the stuff that's going on for Lena, with, you know, uni stuff. I won't go too much into it because I don't want to spoil it. But some stuff goes down for Lena that's pretty hard for her to talk about with other people, and that makes her feel really isolated and ashamed. So there's that perspective as well that we're getting. And then we also have the nephew, who's called Will, and Will has been in prison, and he's out of prison, and he has been in a relationship with a woman who has children, and they've just broken up, and he's sort of a little bit out at sea and not sure what's happening with his life and where to go next and what to do next. He's lost his job, he doesn't have his partner, he's missing the kids. It's just a really hard situation for him, and it's sort of how these three lives impact on each other and kind of come together. One of the things that I didn't love about this book is that the lack of communication between these three characters did grate on me a little bit. So yeah, it was, for example, and I'll give the example that's the least spoilery. So Will has this horrific toothache, like a tooth needs to be taken out kind of toothache, and he doesn't tell anybody, and he has no money, and he's needs painkillers, he needs antibiotics, he needs to go to the dentist, but he doesn't tell anybody, and so he just suffers with this toothache for like far too long in the book, until something happens with it. So it just bothered me a lot. Just ask, just talk to somebody. And the same thing happens with the other characters as well. They've all got these things that they're trying to deal with on their own, and there's miscommunication and unwillingness to talk to one another about what's going on, which is really frustrating. So that I took a point off for that because it did grate on me a little bit. But yeah, it was also very compelling. And I had no idea when I picked this up, it's actually set in the suburb that I grew up in. So, it was really cool. I've never read a book that's set in the suburb I grew up in. So it was really cool to I know the places they're talking about. I know the shopping center they're talking about. I know the streets they're talking about, the park, all of those kind of things. So, it was kind of cool to read something that's written, in a setting that really, really well. So yeah, that was a cool thing for me too. I ended up giving this 4 stars. It was a really good book. If you can put up with the miscommunications and lack of communication between the characters, enjoyable, definitely enjoyable, and definitely recommended. And the final book, one more, is Mansfield Park. So if you have been following me for a little bit, you'll know that I'm reading through all of the Jane Austen books in publishing order. So this is the 3rd book. I read Sense and Sensibility, and then Pride and Prejudice, and now Mansfield Park. Now, I wasn't sure, and if you watch my TBR, you will hear me saying that I couldn't remember if I'd read this or not. I don't think I've read this before. And I didn't like it. I'm really sorry to say. I ended up giving it 2.5 out of 5 because there were some things I couldn't overlook. Like, I tried quite hard, I think, to not overlay my modern sensibilities and things that are socially acceptable over books that were written in the past, because they're of their time, and it's as a reader of classics, you have to kind of be okay with that, that books are of their time, and that some of the things that happen in them wouldn't fly today, but back then they were acceptable. So here's some of the things that happen in this book, and this is a little bit spoilery, so just be aware of that, that really would not fly today. So one, the we've got, our main character is called Fanny, and she is poor, but her aunt is married to a sir, a landholder in England. And so they're rich, and they decide that they're going to invite one of their nieces to come and live with them, and it ends up being Fanny. So she comes to live with this family and is kind of, for the most part, treated relatively well, but she's always sort of like a second-class citizen. She's got another horrible aunt, Aunt Price, who's just not very nice to her at all and wants her to know her place. And yeah, that part of it is not so great. But then the main problem with this book is that she falls in love with her cousin. So when she comes to them, she's 10 years old. And she falls in love with her older cousin called Edmund. And she's in love with him for like the whole book. So it's not really a surprise. But here's the spoiler. So if you don't want to hear this, you might want to stop watching. She does end up with him at the end. The cousin, who is sort of the kind person to her in this household, while she's a 10-year-old who, and I will read the quote from the end that really kind of grossed me out, in particular. And I quote, "With such a regard for her, indeed, as his had long been, a regard founded on the most endearing claims of innocence and helplessness, and completed by every recommendation of growing worth, what could be more natural than the change, as in the change from cousinly, brotherly, sisterly friendship to love. Loving, guiding, protecting her as he had been doing ever since her being 10 years old, her mind in so great a degree formed by his care." It just, it makes your skin crawl, the grooming, it's just horrible. At that time, I have to try and, at that time it wasn't weird for cousins to marry, but this was a cousin who was brought up in the household, and Edmund was sort of like her kind of helper in the house, the one that kind of got her in the door in the sense of feeling more accepted and at home. And, so she has this gratitude towards him, and they have this relationship that is definitely not equal. And yeah, it just... I just can't. That's the main problem. But there's also some other stuff in there. So Sir Thomas, who's her uncle, is involved in the slave trade, and it's just ever so casually dropped into the conversation, and it just kind of makes you, whoa, okay, right, okay. It's a thing that happened at the time, but it's still, it's hard to kind of look past. Yeah. And then I guess the other thing, related to the relationship, there's another character that she sort of she's not interested in. She actually doesn't like him at all, but he takes an interest in her, and then he proposes to her, and she doesn't want to have a bar of it. And she gets told off by Sir Thomas and is, almost shunned for not accepting this proposal, which would have, married her to somebody with money and property. Even though she knows that of his character, everyone else seems really blind to it. But the fact that they're, hating on her for making a decision about her own life, and telling her she's ungrateful and just don't like it. But I guess the other thing that really bothered me about this as well, because she comes from a family who are poor, and by poor, I don't mean on the street, destitute. They employ servants in their house. but they live in Portsmouth. It's sort of like, yeah, they don't have money to spare. They've got kids running around everywhere, blah, 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 blah. But the way that they're talked about, it's sort of like this disdain for the poor, or disdain for people who are below you. They're not poor enough to be pitied, like, you know, somebody on the street or a single mother, or I don't know, but they're not of your standing. And even Fanny, after being away for such a long time and going back to her biological family, she has this attitude as well. Like, she just can't tolerate it, can't tolerate the raucous nature of their household and how they're not respectable and blah 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 blah. And it just grates a little bit, you know, just grates a little bit. So yeah, I didn't love this one. You know, I really enjoyed Sense and Sensibility. Pride and Prejudice is a 5-star read for me. This 2.5. I just found it really hard to look past those things in this book. So I'm hoping that next month when I read Emma, that I'm not going to have that same problem. I'm hopeful. My fingers are crossed, because I know that Emma is one that a lot of people's favorite Austen. So I'm hoping that it will become one of my favorites too. But Mansfield Park, unfortunately, is not. I am glad I've read it. Just to say that I have read it, and we're done there. Because I do want to have read all of Austen's work, but not my favorite. My least favorite of what I've read so far. Unfortunately, sorry. All right, so that's it. That is my wrap up for October. Thank you for hanging around and listening to me talk about these books. I hope that my talking about them has given you some recommendations. Maybe you've discovered a book that you hadn't heard of before that sounds intriguing to you, especially if you're not from Australia. I'd really encourage you to give Love Objects a try, and also what was the other one we talked about? The Year the Maps Changed. Give them a go, because we have some amazing authors in Australia that may not be as known worldwide. So definitely get your mitts on these if you can. And I must insist that you all read Islands of Decolonial Love. It just breaks your heart and builds you up at the same time. I loved it. All right, so thanks for hanging around and for, as I said, listening to me rant on about these books. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you on the next one. Bye for now.